Merciless lawyer humiliates widow in court, stunned by her secret evidence. Emma Harper stood at the window of her home, staring out at the quiet street, feeling as though the world had stopped. It had been 3 weeks since her husband, Jack, had passed away unexpectedly. The loss had left a deep, empty space in her heart that no one could fill. Jack had been her rock for over a decade, the man who had always been there for her, through laughter, tears, and every challenge life threw their way. He was more than just her husband. He was her best friend, her partner, the father of their 2 children, and the love of her life. But now, Jack was gone, leaving Emma to face not only her grief, but the responsibilities of a life that suddenly felt so much heavier. The funeral was behind her, the flowers had started to wither, and the people who had expressed their condolences had long since returned to their own lives. It was now just Emma, her children, and the house that once echoed with Jack's presence. As if the weight of Jack's death wasn't enough, Emma had to confront something that seemed almost surreal, a legal battle over Jack's estate. At first, she had hoped it was all a misunderstanding, a mistake in the paperwork. But as the days passed, the truth began to seep in, and Emma realized that what she was about to face was much darker than she could have ever imagined. Jack had always been diligent with his finances, managing his estate with care and clarity. He had made sure that everything was in order for Emma and their children in case anything happened to him. That's why, when Emma received a call from their lawyer, she didn't expect anything unusual. It was supposed to be a routine reading of Jack's will. But what she heard instead left her frozen in shock. Victor Harper, Jack's estranged brother, was named as the sole beneficiary of Jack's estate, bypassing Emma entirely. According to the will, Jack had left everything to Victor, including their family home, the business Jack had worked so hard to build, and all of the assets they had accumulated over the years. Emma's heart sank. This was a man who had barely been in their lives, a man whose relationship with Jack had been strained for years, due to past betrayals and misunderstandings. The idea that Jack would leave him everything, especially after everything they had been through as a family, was unfathomable. Emma's initial instinct was to believe that this must have been a mistake, or perhaps a misunderstanding. Jack had always been clear about his intentions to ensure Emma and their children would be cared for, no matter what. But as the lawyer continued to explain, Emma's doubts only grew. The will was dated just a few weeks before Jack's death, and the signatures appeared to be genuine. Everything seemed in order, at least on the surface. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Jack wouldn't have left her out. There had to be an explanation, and Emma was determined to find it. It wasn't until the lawyer showed her a copy of the forged will that Emma's heart began to race. It was clear now. This wasn't an honest mistake. Someone had forged Jack's signature and altered the contents of the will. But who would do such a thing and why? The realization was overwhelming. Victor and his lawyer, Nathan, had somehow orchestrated this fraudulent document to seize control of Jack's estate. The thought of Victor, a man who had always been distant and, at times, downright malicious, taking everything that Jack had worked so hard for, and leaving Emma and her children with nothing, was beyond devastating. Emma sat in the lawyer's office, her head spinning. She could barely comprehend what she was hearing. Her world had been turned upside down in the blink of an eye, and she felt a wave of anger and disbelief course through her. How could Victor do this? How could someone she once considered family betray her so deeply, so ruthlessly? Her mind raced with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. As Emma processed the situation, her emotions swirled. Grief over Jack's death, confusion over the will, and a growing sense of urgency. She was losing her grip on everything that mattered. The legal fight for Jack's estate felt like a battle she never expected to fight, but one that she was now forced to face head-on. How could she protect her children and honor Jack's memory if someone was actively trying to take everything away from her? For the next few days, Emma was in a daze, struggling to reconcile her grief with the looming legal battle. She spent hours going through the will, hoping for a mistake she could fix. But every time she read it, the same crushing reality set in. The will was forged, and her husband's legacy had been hijacked by someone who had no right to it. But Emma wasn't going to let it end like this. Despite the shock, the anger, and the overwhelming grief, something deep inside her stirred. A fierce determination to fight for what was rightfully hers. Emma knew that she couldn't let Victor win. She couldn't let him take away everything Jack had worked so hard for, and she certainly couldn't let him trample over her and her children's future. It was time to take action, to find the truth, and to prove once and for all that Jack's intentions were being manipulated by the very people who should have been mourning his loss. With newfound resolve, Emma called her lawyer, Mark Johnson, and began to prepare for the legal battle of her life. She would uncover the truth, expose the forgery, and reclaim the life that Jack had promised her. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead would be filled with obstacles, but Emma knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going down without a fight. And so, the fight for Jack's legacy began. In the days following the shocking discovery of the forged will, Emma found herself consumed by a whirlwind of emotions. Grief, confusion, and above all, anger. The reality of losing Jack was one thing, but to have his legacy manipulated and stolen from her was another. Her heart ached, not just for herself, but for their children, who deserved to grow up knowing that their father had loved them deeply and had made provisions for their future. Emma spent sleepless nights poring over the details of the will, trying to find something, anything, that would prove it was false. She reached out to friends and family, hoping for answers, but the situation seemed hopeless. It was clear that Victor had orchestrated this plan with the help of his shrewd lawyer, Nathan. They had set their sights on Jack's estate, and Emma knew she was the only person standing between them and what was rightfully hers. But Emma wasn't the type of person to back down. She had always been a fighter, and now, more than ever, she had to be. Jack had always believed in standing up for what was right, and Emma knew that she had to do the same. Her love for Jack, her commitment to their children, and her desire for justice were the driving forces that kept her going. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to expose the truth, to put an end to this injustice, and to protect what her family had worked so hard to build. No matter how daunting the battle ahead seemed, Emma was determined to fight. She couldn't let Victor's betrayal define Jack's legacy. This fight wasn't just about money or property. It was about her children's future, her late husband's memory, and the principles that mattered most. The wheels of determination began turning as Emma set out to expose the truth. The first step in Emma's battle was finding the right lawyer. She had heard stories about unscrupulous lawyers who took advantage of clients during vulnerable times, and she didn't want to fall victim to that. She needed someone trustworthy, someone with experience in estate disputes, and, most importantly, someone who would understand her determination to fight for justice. After researching several firms, Emma was introduced to Mark Johnson, a seasoned attorney with a reputation for fighting for the underdog. Mark had handled several high-profile cases involving fraud and estate disputes, and his passion for justice was evident in his work. From the moment Emma met him, she knew she had found the right person. Mark was empathetic, yet strong, and he listened intently as Emma poured out her story. He didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, he took the time to understand the full extent of her grief and her resolve. "I will fight for you, Emma. I won't let Victor take what's rightfully yours," Mark said, his voice steady and confident. His words gave Emma a glimmer of hope she hadn't felt in days. Mark immediately began reviewing the case, carefully analyzing the forged will and the legal documents that Victor and Nathan had submitted. He could see the cracks in the defense, the lies that were beginning to unravel. But more than just examining the papers, Mark knew that they needed to dig deeper. The only way to truly expose Victor's deceit was to gather hard evidence that would prove the will was not only forged but part of a larger conspiracy. Mark knew that the key to winning the case lay in the details. The forged will was the foundation of Victor's claim, and if they could prove that the document was fraudulent, everything else would crumble. To do that, they would need expert forensic analysis, people who specialized in handwriting, document authenticity, and the subtle details that could expose a fake signature. Mark enlisted the help of a forensic document examiner, Dr. Alan Moore, a specialist with years of experience in uncovering fraudulent documents. Dr. Moore began his analysis by comparing the signatures on the will with verified samples of Jack's handwriting. It didn't take long for him to identify inconsistencies. The signature on the will didn't match Jack's at all. It was slanted in a way that was completely inconsistent with his usual handwriting. In fact, it appeared that the signature had been added to the will after the document had been signed, possibly even after Jack's death. Dr. Moore also examined the paper and ink used in the will. His findings were telling. The paper wasn't the kind Jack typically used, and the ink was fresh, not aged as it should have been for a document supposedly written weeks before Jack's death. The forensic report confirmed what Emma had suspected all along. The will was not only a fake, it had been fabricated with malicious intent. As the forensic investigation continued, Emma felt a sense of cautious optimism. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. But she knew that Victor wouldn't give up without a fight. Nathan, with all his legal maneuvering, would do everything in his power to cover up the forgery. This was just the beginning, and Emma's resolve would be tested again and again. To further strengthen their case, Mark also hired a private investigator, Laura Bennett, to delve deeper into the events leading up to Jack's death. Laura was tasked with tracking down any witnesses who might have seen or heard anything unusual surrounding Jack's final days. The investigator also looked into Victor's background and connections, hoping to find any evidence that would link him to the forgery. Laura's findings were promising. She discovered that Victor had been in contact with several people who had suspiciously close ties to Nathan, suggesting that the two men had been working together long before Jack's death. Emma had spent the past few weeks overwhelmed with grief, but now, as the investigation progressed, she began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just a widow mourning her loss. She was a woman on a mission, determined to expose the truth and protect her family. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Emma could almost hear Jack's voice in her mind, urging her to stay strong, to keep fighting for what was right. The battle was far from over, but Emma knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let Victor and Nathan take away what was rightfully hers. This was her fight, and she would win it no matter what it took. Victor Harper had always been a man who prided himself on his cunning and ability to manipulate those around him. But when his plot to steal his late brother Jack's estate began to unravel, he knew he had to pull out all the stops to defend his claim. Victor, ever the strategist, wasn't one to back down easily, especially when so much was at stake. The mounting pressure from Emma's legal team was beginning to expose his fraudulent actions, and he knew the stakes of the legal battle had just skyrocketed. Victor's first tactic was to go on the offensive. He would no longer play a passive role in the courtroom. He was determined to regain control of the narrative. With Nathan, his ruthless lawyer, by his side, Victor planned to use any means necessary to discredit Emma, undermine her credibility, and keep the court focused on irrelevant details that could distract from the truth of the forged will. Victor's strategy was clear. Turn the spotlight on Emma and make it look like she was the one trying to manipulate the legal system. He hoped that if he could make Emma appear as an opportunist, a person with something to hide, he might confuse the jury and deflect attention away from the damning evidence of the forgery. His next move was a calculated gamble, bringing in a key witness who would cast doubt on Emma's intentions and provide a twisted narrative that could make her look like the villain in the case. Victor's next move was to introduce Laura McKinley, a private investigator who claimed to have gathered crucial evidence about Emma's actions in the days leading up to Jack's death. Laura wasn't a random choice. Victor knew that her experience and investigative skills would lend an air of legitimacy to his defense. She was calm, composed, and appeared professional on the surface, making her an ideal tool to sway the court in his favor. Laura took the stand confidently, her voice steady as she presented her findings. She had gathered testimonies from several witnesses who claimed that Emma had been planning the legal dispute long before Jack had passed away. According to Laura, Emma had been in constant contact with various legal professionals, hinting that she was preparing to challenge Jack's will. This, Laura argued, proved that Emma was scheming to take control of the estate from the very beginning and that her actions were premeditated. The court was taken aback by Laura's testimony. She painted a picture of Emma as a woman who had been strategically laying the groundwork for a property dispute, using Jack's death as a stepping stone to secure her financial future. To Victor, this was a brilliant move. If he could successfully portray Emma as manipulative and dishonest, he could shift the focus away from the forgery and onto her alleged ulterior motives. But Emma was not going to let Laura's testimony go unchallenged. As Laura continued to paint her as the villain, Emma sat in the courtroom with a growing sense of frustration. This woman, who had no direct ties to Jack, was fabricating a narrative that threatened to destroy everything she had fought for. Emma knew she had to expose Laura's testimony for what it was, an outright lie. The real battle began when Laura presented what she claimed was evidence to support her testimony. She produced a series of emails, documents, and financial records that she asserted were proof of Emma's preoccupation with the estate long before Jack's passing. According to Laura, these records indicated that Emma had been in communication with several lawyers and financial advisors, discussing how to challenge the will. The evidence seemed compelling at first, too compelling, in fact. As the jury examined the documents, Emma's stomach sank. How had this happened? How had Victor's team managed to produce such convincing evidence? The emails appeared legitimate, the records were meticulously detailed, and the timeline seemed to line up perfectly with Laura's story. It was a stroke of brilliance on Victor's part. If they could convince the court that Emma had been plotting against Jack all along, they could discredit the entire case. But Emma had one ace left to play. She knew that this fabricated evidence couldn't go unchecked, not if she wanted to win. Her lawyer, Mark Johnson, had been suspicious from the beginning. Something about the way the evidence was presented didn't sit right with him, and he decided to dig deeper into the documents. Mark immediately contacted a forensic document expert, Dr. Sarah Peterson, to analyze the emails and financial records. The results were astonishing. Upon closer inspection, Dr. Peterson discovered several inconsistencies that had been deliberately hidden in the fine print. The timestamps on the emails had been manipulated, showing that some of the communications had been created after Jack's death, proof that the evidence had been tampered with. The financial records, which seemed so authentic at first glance, contained a series of discrepancies that could only be explained by forgery. The handwriting on certain documents was inconsistent with Emma's, and the signed documents had been altered in such a way that they could not have been legitimate. Dr. Peterson also discovered that the email addresses used in the communications had been fabricated and were not tied to any legitimate law firms or advisors Emma had ever worked with. It was clear Laura's evidence was nothing but an elaborate setup to deceive the court. Mark wasted no time in presenting this new information to the court. He cross-examined Laura, forcing her to explain the discrepancies in the evidence she had provided. Under pressure, Laura faltered. Her once confident demeanor cracked, and her explanations seemed more and more incoherent. The fabricated emails, once so convincing, now appeared to be nothing more than a series of lies constructed to discredit Emma. It didn't take long for the jury to realize the truth. Victor and his team had gone to great lengths to create a false narrative, using fabricated evidence to try to ruin Emma's credibility. The courtroom atmosphere shifted as the tide began to turn in Emma's favor. The jury, once uncertain, now saw the defense for what it truly was: a desperate attempt to cover up a forgery and manipulate the legal system. With the fabricated evidence exposed, Emma felt a surge of relief. The tide of the case had shifted, and she knew the truth would eventually prevail. But the fight was far from over. Victor's ruthless determination meant that he would continue to throw everything he had at her. This was just one battle in a larger war, and Emma was ready for whatever came next. As the defense rested after Laura McKinley's testimony and the fabricated evidence she presented, the courtroom grew tense. The air felt thick with uncertainty. Victor and Nathan had done everything they could to plant doubt in the minds of the jury, but Emma and her lawyer, Mark Johnson, weren't ready to back down just yet. The conspiracy was starting to unravel, and Emma's fight for justice was far from over. Mark knew that the key to dismantling Laura's testimony was to expose her credibility as a witness. Laura had already been caught off guard during the cross-examination, but Mark wasn't finished. He had prepared for this moment, carefully planning the next steps in his strategy to show the court that Laura had no genuine evidence and was simply a pawn in Victor's game. He was determined to drive the final nail into the coffin of her fabricated story. During the follow-up questioning, Mark asked Laura about several specific details in her testimony. He focused on the inconsistencies in the timeline she had provided and pressed her on the origins of the fabricated documents. Laura became increasingly defensive, struggling to answer with the same level of confidence she had earlier. Mark continued to expertly probe, using her own words against her. The cracks in her story began to show, and it became apparent to everyone in the courtroom that Laura was not a reliable witness. She had either been misled or complicit in a carefully orchestrated conspiracy, and her testimony now seemed more like an act of desperation than a solid defense strategy. At one point, Mark referred back to a crucial piece of evidence: the phone records Laura had submitted as part of her investigation. Mark pointed out that the records didn't match the timeline of events as they had been presented, showing that Laura had been in contact with Victor far more frequently than she had admitted. This raised significant doubts about the true nature of Laura's involvement in the case. Under Mark's relentless questioning, Laura's composure faltered. Her responses became more hesitant, and the once confident investigator now seemed unsure of herself. The jury watched closely as the last vestiges of Laura's credibility crumbled. It was clear her testimony was not just flawed, but intentionally misleading. The defense had used her to create a web of lies that now appeared to be falling apart under scrutiny. With Laura's testimony in tatters, it was time to turn the spotlight onto the irrefutable evidence that would expose the full extent of the conspiracy. Emma and Mark knew they had one ace left to play: compelling forensic evidence that would not only expose the forged will, but also provide irrefutable proof of the fraudulent actions Victor and Nathan had taken to steal the estate. Mark had already arranged for Dr. Sarah Peterson, the forensic document expert, to investigate the key pieces of evidence that had been submitted by Victor's defense. Dr. Peterson had spent weeks meticulously analyzing the forged documents, and her findings were devastating. As Dr. Peterson took the stand to present her findings, the courtroom fell silent. She began with the forged will, carefully walking through the forensic analysis that had revealed multiple inconsistencies. The ink used in the will didn't match the type of pen that would have been available to Jack at the time of its creation. The paper itself showed signs of being much newer than the document's alleged creation date, and the signature that was purported to be Jack's looked like it had been traced over, with no natural variation or pressure in the strokes. The evidence in this case, the judge began, has been clear, thorough, and indisputable. The forged will presented by the defense was not only a blatant act of fraud, but also a violation of the trust and respect owed to the deceased. The testimony of the defendant's witness, Laura McKinley, was shown to be both manipulated and misleading, and the evidence presented by the plaintiff, Emma Harper, has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that the will in question was fraudulent. The judge's words resonated in the room, and Emma felt a rush of emotion flood over her. She had known from the beginning that she was fighting for justice, but now, with the judge's words confirming what she had believed all along, it felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The judge continued, finds in favor of the plaintiff, Emma Harper. The fraudulent will is hereby declared null and void. Emma Harper is the rightful beneficiary of her late husband's estate, as he intended. A sense of relief washed over Emma, her heart pounding in her chest. The legal battle that had consumed her for so long was finally over. Justice had been served, and she could now begin to rebuild her life and honor Jack's memory in the way he had always intended. But the victory wasn't without its consequences for Victor. As soon as the judge made his ruling, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. While Emma's heart swelled with relief, the reality of the situation began to sink in for Victor and Nathan. They had not only lost the legal battle, they were about to face serious criminal charges. As the court proceedings concluded, the police, who had been waiting outside the courtroom, immediately moved in to arrest Victor. The charges against him were severe: forgery, fraud, and conspiracy. Victor had used every tool at his disposal, manipulating documents, fabricating evidence, and even enlisting the help of a private investigator to deceive the court and steal what wasn't rightfully his. His actions had been calculated and cold-hearted, and now, the full weight of the law would fall upon him. Victor's face drained of color as he was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his hands trembling. His world, which had been carefully built on lies and deceit, was crumbling before him. There was no escape now. He had thought that with Nathan's help, he could manipulate the legal system to his advantage, but now, he was facing the consequences of his own actions. The arrest was a public spectacle, and word of Victor's crimes quickly spread. His reputation, once built on influence and power, was now in tatters. The very people he had tried to manipulate were now turning their backs on him. Victor had tried to destroy Emma's life for personal gain, but in the end, it was his own downfall that would be his undoing. Nathan, too, was facing the fallout from the case. The attorney's professional reputation was left in ruins. His association with Victor's fraudulent actions would forever tarnish his career. No longer trusted in the legal community, Nathan would face disciplinary action from the Bar Association, and the stain on his record would follow him for the rest of his life. His career, built on deceit and manipulation, had ended in disgrace. As Victor was led away, Emma felt a profound sense of justice settling over her. She had fought hard for this moment, and though it had come at great personal cost, she now knew that she could finally put the past behind her. The victory wasn't just about winning in court. It was about reclaiming her life and her dignity. For Emma, the ordeal had been long and painful, but with the court's verdict and Victor's arrest, she could now begin to move forward, secure in the knowledge that justice had prevailed. As the courtroom doors closed behind her, Emma stepped into the bright sunlight outside, her heart light with a sense of victory. The months of torment, legal battles, and sleepless nights had finally come to an end. She had faced one of the most trying challenges of her life, fighting not only for her late husband's estate, but also for the honor of his memory and their shared future. With the court's ruling in her favor, Emma had won more than just a legal case. She had won back her life. The long battle, full of twists and turns, had left her feeling drained. Yet the moment the judge declared her the rightful beneficiary of Jack's estate, she could finally breathe a sigh of relief. It wasn't just the material gain that brought her joy. It was the feeling that justice had been served. The deceitful actions of Victor and Nathan had been exposed for all to see, and their attempt to rob her of her dignity and Jack's legacy had been thwarted. For Emma, this victory wasn't about money. It was about standing up for what was right, about fighting back against those who sought to tear her down. She had done it not just for herself, but for Jack, the love of her life. And in that victory, Emma found strength, pride, and a renewed sense of purpose. Her lawyer, Mark Johnson, stood beside her as they walked down the courthouse steps. "You did it, Emma," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You stayed strong through it all. Justice has been served." Emma smiled at him, her eyes wet with the remnants of her tears. "We did it, Mark. I couldn't have done it without you." It was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another, one where Emma could start to reclaim the peace and happiness she had lost in the wake of her husband's passing. And with Jack's memory now secure, Emma could finally begin to heal. In the weeks that followed the trial, Emma took time to reflect on the love and bond she had shared with Jack. His sudden passing had left a void in her heart, but now, with the legal battle behind her, she could focus on honoring his memory in a way that felt true to their relationship. Jack had always been a kind, caring man. Someone who put others first, someone who would never have wanted his family to be caught in such a vicious dispute. He had loved Emma deeply, and she had always known that his love for her would remain in her heart, no matter what. As she walked through the estate, she began to make plans for how she would use the property. She decided to restore parts of the house to its former glory, to create a space where she could not only remember Jack, but also live in a way that felt full of life, love, and hope. She knew Jack had wanted her to live fully, to honor his memory by continuing to move forward with strength, even in his absence. The garden where they had spent countless hours together, planting flowers, laughing, and dreaming of the future, was to be her sanctuary. It would be a place for her to reconnect with the memories they had shared, and a place for new memories to blossom. The house, which had once felt cold and hollow after his death, now felt like a living tribute to their love. But it wasn't just the estate that Emma wanted to preserve in Jack's honor. She began to reach out to charities and organizations that Jack had supported throughout his life. She knew that he would have wanted to continue making a difference in the lives of others, and she vowed to do just that. By continuing his legacy, Emma would find healing and peace, knowing that Jack's kindness would ripple out into the world long after he was gone. For Emma, the final piece of the puzzle was finding peace within herself. She had fought for so long, against so many obstacles, that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without fear, without the weight of the past pressing down on her. In the quiet moments of the early mornings, as she sat on the porch with a cup of tea in hand, Emma would look out over the estate, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the journey she had been through. The pain and heartache that had once seemed insurmountable had softened. With the knowledge that justice had been served, she could finally let go of the anger and resentment that had festered inside her during the worst of the trial. Her peace was found in the simple act of moving forward. No longer did she need to look over her shoulder, waiting for the next strike from Victor or Nathan. They were gone from her life, their malicious intentions thwarted by the truth. Emma could now focus on what truly mattered: her own happiness, her future, and the legacy she would carry on in Jack's name. Emma spent more time with friends, people who had supported her through the toughest moments of the trial, reminding her that she wasn't alone in the world. She traveled, rediscovered hobbies she had once loved, and even began taking long walks through the estate, just enjoying the peace that came with a clear conscience and a heart full of hope. And every evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Emma would stand on the porch, a soft smile playing on her lips, and speak to Jack. "I did it, love," she would say softly. "I did it for us. For you." Though Jack was no longer physically with her, Emma felt his presence with her every day. And as she moved forward into the next chapter of her life, she knew that his love and legacy would continue to guide her, bringing peace and strength when she needed it most. The future, once uncertain and filled with grief, was now a place of endless possibility. Emma was ready to embrace it with courage, with grace, and with the unwavering love of a woman who had triumphed over all odds.